civilization. How do we define that? Merriam-Webster defines it a few ways, including 1. A relatively high level of cultural and technological development, and specifically the stage at which the keeping of written records is attained. 2. The refinement of thought, manners, or taste. And 3. Most simply, the process of becoming civilized. And what history tells us is that this so-called advanced form of civilization started on the east side of the planet, somewhere between 4 and 3000 BC, between two rivers, otherwise known as Mesopotamia, located amidst the places that we call Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Kuwait today. The culture that was spawned between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers distinguished itself as the earliest society to so advance in literacy, astronomy, agriculture, law, mathematics, architecture. And in spite of nearly constant warfare, Mesopotamia became the motherland of the world's first urban centers, including the city of Babylon. And then, around 2000 BC, another one began in the place that we now call China. And while sociologists and social anthropologists could enjoy a robust discussion on the particular critical defining elements of an organized, developed civilization, most would agree that those elements must include the following: central population centers, shared communication strategies, systems for administering territories, a complex division of labor, a specific system for dividing people into specific social and economic classes, a governmental infrastructure of an administrative bureaucracy, and monuments or temples of specific spiritual value with specialized spiritual ministers by which to manage and cultivate those monuments or temples. But as Walloon Pierre Minuit stared into the dark eyes of those 22 displaced Angolans huddled together along the Heere Wegh before that fledgling construction project of sorts, at that open, muddy clearing at the island's southern tip, his impassioned soul wrestled with the dutiful commitment that he had made, not just to his employers, but to the 200 plus of his reformed Protestant brethren who had risked life and limb alongside him in order to forge this civilization with their bare hands. Each one and all of these Calvinist refugees had known war and oppression their entire lives. Their parents and grandparents had struggled and scratched and clawed their way through a war that would in fact continue for 80 years, and was the impetus for this bold venture forth to the unknown side of the planet, in the quest of carving out a new society in which they could live and worship according to the tenets that drive their souls: freedom for their religion and liberty for their conscience. And whether they started out in Aven or Wesel, La Rochelle, or right here on this very land that these Christians were now calling New Netherland, for the time being, Walloon Pierre Minuit had righted and stabilized this civilization for all of them. And even in spite of its tragic false start, because of Minuit's relentless commitment to these key stakeholders, that he would never become his oppressor. The Dutch, the Walloons, and even the Algonquins all took him at his word, and they sealed their trust with the consummation of the transferal of the entirety of this majestic and strategic island. And as that ambitious August sun climbed higher above this fertile green island, and that interminable bay wind billowed across the beleaguered faces of these 22 African prisoners, Pierre Minuit knew in his heart that yet another quandary was suddenly before him. Because this Walloon, whose family had been in exile his entire life, had never enslaved anyone. And so, This lifelong refugee and stalwart servant of God was going to need to dig deep into his own soul in order to arrive at a reckoning, one that would not only square him with the people before him, but most ultimately with his God. You see, the underlying truth in Governor Pierre Minuit's heart was that they were really all refugees, bound together by that very fact and by this relentless and unforgiving commitment to live free or die within this odd and innovative civilization on the western half of the planet, an uncharted and unprecedented frontier centered on this fertile, gestating, yet still remarkably wild island of Manhattan. Welcome to Island, our lost American history. The incredible first 300 years of this incredible place that we now call New York. My name is Chance Kelly. Welcome aboard. Episode 10, Minister. Amidst the cavalcade of complications that Governor Pierre Minuit was facing in forging this civilization out of the untamed wilderness, money and resources were no small part of it. By 1627, company shares were trading for less than they were during Ooselink's initial public offering back in 1621. And to add insult to injury, this so-called grand design was anything but grand, and it was hardly going at all according to the design that they had envisioned. Since the launch of that initiative back in 1623, the company had been focused on that very thing that young Willem Ooselinks had been fixated on since he was a little boy under Spanish rule: the Spanish Silver Fleet, or the veritable core of the world's economy. After all, that was essentially what this grand design was all about: seizing Iberian possessions and utilizing them in the interest of financing Dutch endeavors across the globe. But as our friend Wim Klooster tells us so magnificently in his book, The Dutch Moment, none of this was going according to this company design. Colonists, mostly Walloons, were leaving Minuit's island in droves as soon as their service contracts were up, usually a period of 3 years, but sometimes even before that, choosing to endure the known and established persecution in a feudal Europe rather than scratch and claw to survive on this primitive and vastly undersupplied island. Undersupplied, yet as a result of Minuit's ambitious surge forward, now in the midst of multiple capital projects, all of which, in spite of Minuit's impassioned spirit, were desperately lacking sufficient labor. Malemaker's Mill and second-floor church were well underway, as was the excavation for Queen Frederick's Fort, itself of that remarkably ambitious design of enveloping the entire city, and to be constructed of nearly impenetrable quarry stone. And the hard truth is, none of that was ever going to happen. But don't try to tell that to visionary entrepreneur Pierre Minuit, or to his starchy bosses in that oversized boardroom back in Amsterdam. But when the rubber hits the road, something must fuel that engine, and someone has to actually build that road that wasn't there yet, and that dock that didn't exist, and install that drainage they didn't have, along with the daunting and growing list of public implementations and services necessary for any proper civilized society. Not to mention farms and fields that needed to be cleared and tilled, and competent farm workers necessary to actually feed this hungry, struggling band of refugees. No. In spite of the ambition of the ruling class of investors back in Amsterdam and their unrelenting governor, none of this was getting done effectively on the island of Manhattan. But then again, none of that was the fault of Walloon Pierre Minuit, who had reluctantly accepted this job that his predecessor was too inept and ill-prepared to do. And now, only in his first full year, Minuit and his wary council held little sway over the decisions of the company directors, let alone over the Heere Wegh, or the Gentlemen 19, which was the exclusive group of 19 of the company directors representing each of the 5 company chambers: Zeeland 4, North Holland, West Friesland 2, Friesland, Groningen 2, Rotterdam 2, and Amsterdam 8, plus 1 representative from the States General of the Dutch Republic. And all 19 of them felt fairly helpless as far as their own ability to shore up the ineffectiveness of this disastrous grand design. And with this young company already leaning toward failure, this colony at the mouth of the river that the rogue Hudson had discovered 2 decades earlier was becoming an increasingly annoying thorn in the side of those directors back in Amsterdam. So, as Minuit's eyes passed over the 22 uneasy newcomers staring ominously across the expansively staked-out fort, he afforded himself the liberty to excuse his conscience momentarily in order to consider certain other practical components of the prerogatives of his employer. Because if there was anything that Governor Pierre Minuit was sure of, it was that this island was in desperate need of labor. And one thing that Walloon Pierre Minuit knew for certain was that he did not enslave any of these people, nor did he capture them, nor transport them against their will to this island. And he also knew that as chief executive of this nascent colony, he alone possessed the singular authority to create as fair and righteous an environment for these oppressed Angolans as possible during their stay here, for however long that may be. Division of labor. A system for dividing people into specific social and economic classes. Governmental infrastructure of an administrative bureaucracy. None of these tenets were conceived by Pierre Minuit, yet all of them were being imposed upon him by the directors of the Dutch West India Company. And as the boots on the ground that Minuit and his council were, it was incumbent upon them to determine the aforementioned refinement of thoughts, manners, or tastes required of this gestating civilization. And the most logical means of acquiring that refinement would be using a model outside of this settlement, yet reasonably accessible to it. And while Isaac de Ressier had visited Governor Bradford and his Plymouth Pilgrims the year prior, what he reported was that while the people of New Netherland may technically share the Reformed Protestant faith with these Puritans, that this band practiced a version of Christianity, unlike any that these Manhattan colonists had ever witnessed. And what de Ressier recounted for Minuit and the council described a devoutness whereby these cloaked men, all of them, marched in a piously militaristic manner up the hill to the fort, which doubles as a meeting house, where they sang psalms passionately and heard William Brewster's sermons, while each and all of them were armed to the hilt, with de Ressier specifically articulating, they were constantly on their guard, night and day, which could definitely be explained by that aforementioned absence of je ne sais quoi. Because in spite of having been provided refuge by the Dutch for several decades in Leiden, the Puritans regarded their so-called shared Reformed faith as merely incidental and not in any way binding them to the colonists in New Netherland. Minuit and his band of soulful, earthbound Walloons may have found peace with their natives, but in truth, that didn't put them in any higher stead in the eyes of these avowed separatists. To consider that John Robinson and this band had fled England in protest of its myopic authoritarianism is to realize the hypocrisy of these holier-than-thou parochialists. For de Ressier's part, in effort to consummate this true love and friendship, he had presented Bradford with 50 pounds of Zewant, or premium Long Island wampum, and in presenting the gift, de Ressier congenially encouraged them to take it a few hundred miles north, up the coast, to trade with the natives along the Kennebec River in today's Maine. The diplomatic methods and practices of the Algonquins having taken hold of them, de Ressier and Minuit trusted that Bradford and his people would comply. But the Puritans didn't care what the Dutch wanted them to do with this wampum, because their talk of love and friendship was nothing more than that. Talk. Within a short time, the Puritans had decided that they had somehow become anointed as the universal purveyors of wampum. Curious, in that Dutchman Adrian Block just happened to have unequivocally discovered and introduced the true purpose and significance of the device to the European world nearly 2 decades earlier. And sure enough, with de Ressier's gift, Bradford's opportunistic separatists proceeded to not go north, as earnestly suggested by their friends from Manhattan, but rather took it south, to the mouth of the Connecticut River, to the place that we call Old Saybrook today, which just happened to be part of New Netherland. Through their history in Leiden and their shared Calvinist faith, Minuit and his colony operated under the false impression that these separatists shared this continent with them in the interest of love and good neighborhood, just as they had written. But for all William Bradford's flowery words, whether in English, French, or Dutch, New Netherland had no Puritan friends in the place that we now call Massachusetts, and never would. And in spite of all of Minuit's indomitable efforts, this had devolved into a dire time for this 3-year-old colony centered on the Manhattan. Amidst the population's mass exodus, it was also suffering a snowballing exodus of spirit, with company shares at an all-time low, increasing pressure and competition from the English, and a grand design that could be more fittingly called a grand dud. The company directors, now refocusing on territories with far more profit potential to their calculating Calvinist eyes, unbeknownst to Minuit or anyone else on Manhattan, were now considering scrapping this failing experiment of New Netherland altogether. Yet almost inexplicably, amidst this swelling deterioration, the directors back in Amsterdam did something remarkable. They ultimately came to heed the appeal of Minuit and his council in spite of this financial freefall, and at long last, finally agreed to send a proper, ordained minister to the island of Manhattan. Perhaps it was nothing more than the pious director's last-ditch Hail Mary for this failing colony. Or perhaps it was a more formative attempt to advance this nascent Western civilization above and beyond its closest neighbor. After all, for all their sanctimoniousness, Plymouth's resident preacher, William Brewster, was no more a minister than was the uneducated layman, Bastian Jansen Kroll, back in New Netherland. With no ordained credentials, Brewster held no more theocratic authority than Kroll, Huggen, or Minuit. And this, the company directors knew, and they were willing to make at least this one final investment in their struggling colony before packing up ship. In the 4 months leading up to January 1628, Amsterdam and the North Sea saw thunder and windstorms so incessant and so intense, few, if any, Dutchmen had ever seen the like before. Perhaps a fitting premonition for the occasion itself, yet certainly fitting for the character of this particular minister. The Leiden-educated Dominie Jonas Michaelius made the harrowing crossing on a ship called the Three Kings, along with his pregnant wife and 2 young daughters. His family came along because this was not an exploratory mission. Dominie Jonas Michaelius was coming to Manhattan to stay. You see, Francois Mullemaker's second-floor church, at first glance, may have seemed second-rate, but the directors were going to supercharge it with the fire and brimstone of a bona fide Calvinist minister. Perhaps it was only this very divine guidance that was holding this fledgling colony back, that all things work together for good to those that love him. And perhaps the sanctity of the soul of this particular civilization was ultimately a matter of a certain moral discipline that it had never quite had, not in the eyes of the Dutch West India Company, anyway. And hunched over his candlelit desk below deck, the hard-edged 44-year-old projected quite a different image than the buoyantly youthful Bastian Jansen Kroll. And as Michaelius reread his company contract, he seemed as much like a soldier as a minister. Which would make sense, because his father, Johann Michaelius, prior to his own ordainment back in 1580, had been a special forces operative closely aligned with the revered William the Silent during the 80 Years' War. And Johann's particular specialty was guerrilla warfare-style attacks on unsuspecting Catholic priests in his home region of Flanders. So you see, this was hardly a family of Protestant pacifists. The Michaelius clan was by nature a band of fighting Flemish fanatics. A man of God, Jonas Michaelius was, but man of peace? Well, as far as the Catholics were concerned, no. And as far as any other dissidents, well, we'll see. And when Jonas Michaelius set foot on the hard-packed mud of Pearl Street that first chilly Friday morning in April 1628, Minuit knew right away that this was going to be a challenge. No one had his finger on the pulse of this colony like Governor Pierre Minuit. And while grit and toughness were essential on this island, the soulful Walloon could immediately see the problem in this Flemish minister's eyes. And Minuit not only knew that such rigidity had already done in his predecessor, but that outright arrogance had gotten men killed here. After the council welcomed the humorless Michaelius and his silent family standing at attention, they were led down Pearl Street to what would serve as the family's quarters for the time being. Mrs. Michaelius was looking decidedly uneasy on her feet as the family moved toward their assigned shack of bark buried about 6 feet into the earth and roofed with reeds and grass. And now, rigid as he may have been, the Spartan accommodations did not in fact rattle the curmudgeonly Michaelius, because his previous assignment had had him living in a crude Dutch settlement along the Gold Coast of Africa, just west of what we call Accra, Ghana, today, on a tiny patch of land at the top of a hill, barricaded on all sides. And life in that remote outpost was no more glamorous than life would be on the island of Manhattan. So Michaelius knew and accepted the limitations of a civilization that was a work in progress. At least on the surface he did. But while in Ghana, he had also clearly demonstrated his unwavering distaste for the indigenous peoples in these new lands. While stationed in the African settlement, he was asked to administrate over 2 mulatkins, as he called them, 2 little girls, each born out of wedlock, each to an African mother and a Portuguese sailor father. And out of disgust, Michaelius explained, "They were born not out of marriage, but in fornication." These children should be removed from their heathen mothers and taken to Holland to be educated, especially in the Reformed religion. And all discussions of morals and ethics aside, the classis of Enkhuizen, to whom Michaelius had made this appeal, responded to him definitively and in short order. Positis quae ponuntur. The answer was yes. And as the Michaelius family began nesting into their bark hut off Pearl Street, Minuit appeared with 2 of the Angolans to assist with their move-in, and the governor introduced Maiken and a broad-shouldered lad whom they were calling Paolo. Then Minuit stepped back a bit and watched from a distance, and the dynamic that he saw did not suggest a compassionate representative of the Lord Jesus Christ, as much as an ambitious man with a bitter, condescending edge. As the Angolans lent their hand, Minuit saw neither the appreciation nor the patience that he knew in his heart was essential to maintaining a level ship in this newfound civilization. And Minuit silently wondered to himself how this was all going to pan out. Because for all the perceived tenets of this colony, Jonas Michaelius did not come here to propagate liberty of conscience any more than he had to exercise tolerance. He had come here on a contracted assignment in effort to advance his station in the West India Company and in the Dutch Reformed Church. And not unlike the hypocrisy of the separatists in Plymouth, the hypocrisy of the Dutch West India Company recruiting a man like Jonas Michaelius to advance tolerance and diversity in this particular civilization was fairly preposterous. However, fate plays an intriguing and pervasive supporting role in this overall epic story, because at that very moment, 3,000 miles across the Atlantic, at Michaelius's alma mater of the University of Leiden, a young theology student, in his nightly communication with the Lord, was making clear in his divine commitment that he also ascribed to a firmly held belief of the day that said that while civilization may have started in the East, that the future of mankind and the key to its ultimate salvation lay in the West. And as this 21-year-old penniless orphan by the name of Evert Bogart studied his scripture and carefully recorded in his book his innermost notions and passions, he made it clear that he knew that his destiny would in fact be as a shepherd of God on the western half of the planet. And while Jonas Michaelius may have just arrived for the start of his company assignment, this young student back in Leiden nevertheless already had a leg up even on this senior minister. Because you see, this young man had already been chosen by the angel of God himself. And young Evert was not the only one propagating that story, because it was faithfully supported by many reputable theologians and scholars of the day, some of whom had already declared the boy a prophet. And as this divinely endowed child prodigy stared out into the night sky and found Polaris at the extremity of Ursa Minor, he yearned for that day to come for him to migrate west in God's service. But in April of 1628, there was no one, short of perhaps God himself, who could have possibly known that this Evert Bogart, still 4 years shy of legal adulthood, was already eagerly waiting in the wings to understudy the tragically miscast first minister upon this turbulent and still extremely wild island of Manhattan. Island is created, written, and produced by Chance Kelly and Dr. Yap Jacobs. Audio engineer, Sam O'Sullivan. Marketing director, Miss Sophie Basil. We extend special thanks to the remarkable Professor Willem Vrijhof in the Netherlands for his invaluable contributions to this episode. Folks, please be sure to also join us on our YouTube channel at Island Voices 1 on YouTube. Island is a trademark of Chance Kelly, Inc., copyright 2023 by Chance Kelly and Yap Jacobs. May not be reused, reproduced, represented, or rebroadcast in this form or in any other format without written authorization. All rights reserved. Damas and Aaron, we thank you for boarding our voyage of discovery en route to saying, wow, history is cool. We'll see you next time.